God bless. It's an interesting thing, this reality which we're all living in and coinciding together within. One interesting thing which is ever so present within our lives is the space of God itself. And God we can look at as infinite. And the infinite itself is present within everything. And what's extremely amazing about this is that we can see the bigger picture when we involve God, or you could call it infinite, within us as individuals, because for some reason within this reality we separate from the infinite, and we can go into why. However, let's stay practical, that we do enclose ourselves within our own perception. And when we are so caught up within our daily problems and our daily routine and our daily problems, we close ourselves off to the infinite. We close ourselves off to God. And this is our problem, is that we don't stay openly connecting with the infinite. And simply because we can't perceive it when we're experiencing such dense emotions, when we're experiencing stress, worry, financial hardship, frustration, anger, all these emotions which are so dense within its complexity of thought, we can't see the bigger picture. We're not resonating to an open heart, an open existence, an open state of mind. We're so closed off and encaptured within problematic scenarios which we're perceiving as problems, rather than witnessing scenarios and simply surrendering to situations which are out of our control. A lot of the time we love to get ourselves into problems and then lose ourselves within the problems, when the problem itself was, a lot of the time, it's instigated by our minds. Because we don't have control of our minds, we instigate the problem, and then ultimately the mind is fueling a scenario which is going to encapture us within just existence, which can be eliminated. And we'll go into this now. We'll move forward. And what's super interesting is that God itself is whatever you want to refer it to. God is infinite. God is love, purity, purification. God is existence. And that's why we have to see is that if we're feeling so much anger, frustration, if we're caught up in our problems, if we're stressed, worried, if we're feeling hatred, anger, jealousy, God is everything. So if we as individuals are so caught up within an aspect of infinity, and what's super interesting is to understand that the wholesome self, or the self which is complete, the self which is purified, if we are living a version of ourselves which have not examined or calculated to that wholesome self, we as individuals need to understand why we are experiencing life itself. It's super important to understand that everything within our lives is happening for a reason. And as we start to present life as the gift of experience, we will understand that what we are experiencing is what the self needs to equate. And what's very important also to understand is to just be present with the wholesome force. And that wholesome force you could refer to as love. Because when we start to open this topic, you have to dive deep, because you won't get anywhere. The human experience is relative to whatever we experience in this reality. Everything can entertain us. Everything can persuade us within thought. As long as we're experiencing thought, we will always be diverted away from the God self, the infinite self, the loving self, the true self. We will always be represented as an existence away from that God self. Because what we have to understand is that this world is programmed to deceive our purification process. This world is designed to take our infinite potential and divert it from connecting back to its true self. Because once that infinite seed begins to grow, it realizes that its true self, its true potential, its true source doesn't confine to the parameters which this reality is set up to confine us within. And that is why thought itself, perception, programming perception, the mind's perception is so heavily bombarded with dictating circumstances to keep us entertained and to keep us thinking within these circumstances, however, not feeling and integrating with that divine self, God self, loving self, pure self. And it's super interesting because God itself is infinite. However, this reality which we are living within, for some reason, we don't look at this reality as infinite. We don't look at this reality as infinite, because the reality which we are experiencing is enclosed within a system, pretty much. It's a system which we are all confined by. And super interesting, just to throw this in there, is look at nature. And look at nature, how species are just completely and utterly the representation of just it's the inner knowing is the reflection of God. And that is extremely powerful to just soak in, is that the inner knowing is the representation of God. Because when you look at species which are just complete instinctual existences, it's almost like that the representation of purity, and it's just on a different level. And for some reason, the human species is just, at least in this time and age, is so heavily enclosed within its own manipulation and programming, and that we are disconnected from this God self. We are disconnected from this this infinite version of our potential. And we've opened so many different boxes in this video, but I really want to close it up because I don't want to go too out there. But an extreme viewpoint is only a viewpoint. Once we start to realize that this reality is an experience, and our experience should not be dictated of what we think is possible and what is not possible. If we are constantly evolving, our minds are constantly freeing, and as long as we can feel that everything is possible outside of this reality, everything is possible. We only perceive what's possible. Outside this reality, everything is possible. We live in an infinite existence. And for some reason, our point of attention is enclosed and encaptured within this existence. The God self is existence to infinite potential. And once we start to connect to this infinite existence outside of this reality, we start to channel the God self. We start to channel God into our lives. And what we do when we start to channel that energy is we awaken, we wake up, we open our hearts, we open our minds, and we access the divine self. And that divine self is effectively our birthright, as the manipulation which is contaminating our potential is effectively enclosing our potential from accessing that God self. Because once we access that God self, we realize that we cannot be affected no longer. We cannot affect our species, our own self. We become the pure existence, and that pure existence may be awaiting us with time to come. And this time, this reality, this time and age and this present moment, there is definitely energy which is definitely influencing it's influencing choice for people to choose what they want to represent. And when we start to connect back to our hearts and our true self, we represent the true self. And the true self, the true divine self, knows what's right and what's wrong. The true divine self knows what's right and what's wrong. And however, the mind is definitely thrown in the middle of that connection and our knowing of what's right and what's wrong to give us choice. And that choice is ultimately to choose the light or to suffer in the darkness. And it just goes back to, feeling rather than thinking. Do we feel what's right? What's the true path? How do we open our love, our happiness, our joy, our connection to these emotions? Or do we stay within the perception of ignorance and deceit and darkness? It's a beautiful thing. And that's why when I start this video and I say, we talk about God, is because God is the true knowing. And whatever we're thrown in, if we're thrown in this reality as souls, or as whatever we want to call, divine self, and we place ourselves in this reality, well, then it's our question to ask: do we stay within the perception of confinement, or do we open ourselves up to the true God self? And that true God self knows what's going on here. That true self knows what is going on here. And we can all manifest within that God self. And that's the beauty of this reality, is this reality gives us choice, and then we get to prove to it goes deep, and in all due respect, who knows why we placed ourselves here? Is it just to, experience humanity and try and implement a positive footprint for generations to come? Potentially, we don't know. But what we do know is that this reality is extremely confined, and the consciousness which is confining this reality is harnessing our potential and using it against us to create ignorance, fear, anger, frustration. All this energy, all this emotion, suffering is definitely being used to for whatever you want to call it. It's being used to enhance an existence which is not truth. And that existence may be ignorance, whatever, it doesn't matter. However, the truth will only continue to unleash its true existence. And that's where choice comes in, and we get to choose how we live our existence, whether we live it with ignorance or we live it with love, compassion, joy, gratitude. It all comes down to choice, and it all comes down to connecting back to that God self, forming the connection, integrating that inner knowing, and then overpowering. This infinite knowing is so much more powerful than the mind. The mind can think whatever it wants. The inner knowing knows what's the truth. The mind can manipulate the truth, but it can never confine us within ignorance. Once we start to believe that there is something greater outside this reality, there is truth outside this reality, there is love outside this reality, and we have the power to choose that. Bang.